In the early days of component hi-fi, it was really a post-World War II thing where guys that had been in the radio corps in the war took their skills of electronics and decided, hey, I could make a really great sounding phonograph out of this stuff. It was basically a box of parts and an instruction sheet, and you had to solder it all together, and if you were lucky when you were finished and plugged it in, it worked. It was really component hi-fi made up of different manufacturers' parts put together. And of course, that required some expertise, and that gave rise to specialty shops that specialized in high-fidelity components. That then changed when the Japanese companies came in with, for the same price as a kit, you could now buy a fully assembled and tested unit. Acoustic Research was an iconic American brand that had miniaturized the full-range loudspeaker into a box that could fit into a typical domestic living room. This was quite revolutionary at the time. Previous to that, it was a theater system with horns and these big giant boxes and, very ugly industrial-looking thing. In 1972 in Munich, there was a conference of distributors for acoustic research loudspeakers.
Many of them were also the importers of an American brand, Marantz. So those importers really had acoustic research speakers and Marantz Electronics, and those products went together.
There was some news at this conference that was very disturbing to the distributors. Marantz had been sold to a Japanese company, and they had decided that they were going to bring out a line of loudspeakers. Most of the distributors were not that pleased with the direction that Marantz Electronics had been going in at that time. And the final straw was when they said, we're going to produce our own loudspeakers and we expect you all to sell them.
No way we're going to get controlled by one vendor. These were entrepreneurial and capable business people, and they weren't going to be pushed around.
And one of the ideas that they had was, why don't we make our own electronics brand? That was really the seed that started NAD, was the distributors wanting to have a product that represented their musical values, their commercial values, and that they could distribute and have some control over.
Marty Borsch was the president, managing director of Acoustic Research. So he was dealing with all of these importers on the loudspeaker brand.
Marty was amazing in his human skills and a very trustworthy guy, which I think was extremely important.
Loved music, obviously. He was an audiophile and just passionate about music. Marty was the kind of executive that didn't just have a business relationship with his customers. He had a very personal, very integrated relationship with the people he did business with.
I always had a love of music. I realized at a very early age that I lacked the talent necessary to make a career in the field of music. So I reluctantly followed in the family business, which was optometry. And at that time, I suddenly realized that there was a whole world of music reproduction in the home, which was a field called high fidelity. And I got into it in a big way and went to the hi-fi shows and used my limited budget to buy inexpensive equipment. I made kits. I put together speaker systems, and it was wonderful. And it then dawned on me that this is a field of endeavor that possibly I could make a contribution to this field. My wife encouraged me. She knew how unhappy I was as an optometrist. And I did. I gave up the practice and went back to school. And there I was in my 30s, starting all over again. And I graduated as an electronic engineer. And I very quickly got a job with a company that was the beginning of what turned out to be a lifetime in the field of music reproduction.
So he was there during that foundational meeting when they were trying to figure out, okay, how do we get this electronics brand off the ground?
I had a chat with one of the executives at AR, and we talked about this problem that I was facing in the international market. So he said, it's not Marantz that's important. It's your network that's important. Your guys, they know their market. So I thought to myself, he's right. I have to go out to my guys and talk to them about the idea of setting up a business where we make our own electronics and then we are not beholden to anybody.
I think Marty had very broad industry relationships. I think he knew of some potential sources for these products that could be relabeled kind of as a private label.
And I remember Elena came with me on this trip, and we got in a car, we drove all over Europe. And in every country, I explained my brilliant idea, and they all looked at me and said, you're crazy. Finally, I got to Germany. I was getting a little discouraged at this point, and I met the two guys in Germany who were handling our distribution. And I explained this idea. What an idea! We love it! And do you think you know how to do this? I said, yeah, I know how to do this. Sure, I can do it. He said, well, then let's do it.
So Marty came back and he said, I think I've found some products that we can relabel. We're going to have to come up with a name for the brand.
Then when we go to a hi-fi show, I remember this, they always list all the companies that are showing alphabetically. So I had the Association of Audio Distributors, AAD, will be the first name listed. So I told that to my guys in Germany. AAD, we don't like that. How about NAD? So I said, that defeats the whole purpose. Oh, well, don't worry about it. Anyway, we already registered it. It's done. So that was it. So I said, well, what does it stand for? Neue akustische Dimension. Forget it. It's going to be NAD, and if anyone asks, you don't know.
It was a quite unusual sort of formula in the beginning that this was the way it was driven by the people that actually sell the product rather than being driven from a manufacturer's point of view, mostly European and sometimes American.
We were just starting to see companies think about moving some of their production offshore. As distributors or importers, the owners of NAD in those early days, they had no manufacturing. So it was very natural for them to go offshore and start to have products built by contract manufacturers.
Distributors would have to prepay, so they would have to buy letters of credit.
As you can imagine, that was not easy to do, to basically say, okay, Marty, we trust you. Here's our 100,000 Deutschmarks or whatever the local currency was, and you go out and buy these things and we'll take delivery when they're available.
You can picture a big U-shaped table, and Marty would go up and list the countries that were there, list the product ideas, and go around to every distributor and say, okay, if we do that product, how many are you going to buy? They trusted each other. He had built his reputation in the industry on trust, so that transferred beautifully.
Technology moves quickly, products get old, and they needed some fresh new products that had some new capabilities. And there was a young Norwegian engineer that had been working at acoustic research that Marty knew well.
Now, at that time, I had hired a very bright, talented engineer from Dolby Labs by the name of Björn Erik Edvardsson.
Eric was a super cool guy. He always willing to give advice. Any problem he had, he was always trying to help out. He always had this philosophy of just keeping things simple. Look at a problem and approach it from a different angle. Fundamental things in design of product. That was the key thing to him, to keep it simple and have good value and just have the basic designs in there. He was always a good mentor in that respect.
And unlike so many other technical people, he wasn't just focused on technology, but he knew about literature, he knew about music.
And he had all kinds of great ideas on how to make good sounding product that without spending a lot of money.
Those were two elements that came together. The genius of Erik Edvardsson's design capability and the concept of manufacturing in Taiwan to get the lowest possible price.
In order to make NAD a worldwide brand, we have got to manufacture at a low-cost area. Anything coming out of Japan was very expensive. The yen was getting higher and higher and higher. We also have a company in Taiwan that's just starting electronics now called Fulet Enterprises. But Eric and I talked to their engineers and talked to their plant manager. We saw right away that they were good engineers and that they could be taught. Eric agreed to stay in Taiwan and do some training. I went back to the NAD organization. We had a big meeting and I said, we're moving from Japan to Taiwan. We've got an engineer with great ideas and he knows how to make products that sound good and yet don't cost a fortune to make.
In the late 60s, music became the focal point for the cultural revolution that was taking place across the Western world. The cultural revolution was really led by artists like Bob Dylan, the Byrds, the Beatles, who put into words the emotions and the feelings of a new generation of people and started talking about these cultural changes going on, about the war in Vietnam, about all of these things that were impacting the lives of young people. And the words of the songs became very, very important. So there was definitely a need out there for sound systems that could reproduce more accurately. And there was a willing audience of young people for whom that was the most important thing in their lives.
It wasn't until the NAD 3020 came along, which really caused, well, I would say in the hi-fi world, true upheaval. This is the era where you have amplifiers with loads of buttons and big meters and tremendous power. And here came this little unassuming amplifier, which frankly speaking, we all thought looked pretty ugly until you connected it. And I think that's where my relationship with NAD started, because it sounded fantastic and it would outplay all of these big amplifiers that would cost tons more money. And of course, I was at that age where money was always a problem.
So we thought we'd have our big press party in Britain. I was starting to launch into all the wonderful features that this amplifier had without bothering to mention the key issue, which was that it was only 80 pounds retail.
The concept of the 3020, which was completely new and different from any product in hi-fi up to that moment, I would say driven a lot by Marty and by the key distributors of the day, because they were looking for a product that changed the game.
It's a fact that that product reached a market of people, that this would be the people who didn't have a lot of money. They were either students or newly married or on a tight budget, but they loved music. And this very small, simple amplifier would sound better than many amplifiers selling for 3 or 4 times the price. And so it proved to be. It was not a very difficult product for Fulet to make, because it was very simple. It changed the industry. And of course, it changed NAD because it took off like a shot in Britain. Fulet was making production runs of 1,000, every week, another 1,000.
The concept for the 3020, the way that Eric approached this, was very different than the way engineers normally approach things. He was a very practical, pragmatic approach. He said, you know, I'm designing these products with a test resistor and a sine wave generator, and we look at distortion. But that's not the way people actually use these products. They're going to hook it up to a loudspeaker, which is a much more complicated load on the amplifier, and we're going to play music through it, which is a much more complicated waveform than a simple waveform.
Eric really early on recognized that music, per definition, is dynamic. So yet there is a difference on what an amplifier can put out continuously, or also what it can do in short moment bursts. If you had a party and you turn your amplifier up too loud, and you may have had a drink, so your hearing isn't that critical anymore, and you hear this distortion that at some point it kills your tweeters, which is not because the amplifier has too much power. No, it's because the amplifier has too little power.
So one of the really interesting innovations that Eric came up with was this idea of soft clipping. Technically, it looked at the power supply, and as it would start to run out of juice, he would limit the power supply and prevent the clipping in the output stage.
The amplifier could see, oh, this is going wrong. So when it gets to the point, it will start to clip. It will start to round off before it starts hitting that maximum line.
Audibly, even if you drove the amplifier into overload, the soft clipping would make that overloaded sound actually quite pleasant. You never got the harsh, edgy sound of a clipped amplifier.
The NAD 3020 was the iconic product that set NAD's course to become the company it is today.
It was touted as the truly musical amplifier, but it's also when NAD realized that this actually is rather special and we can put more of a commercial spin on it as well.
You're going to have a hard time finding any piece of consumer electronics that appreciates in value over time because of that legacy, because of that story, and also because it still outperforms many amplifiers on the market today.
I don't think we know exactly how many were sold, but it is somewhere in between 1.2 and 1.4 million, which is still making it the most sold amplifier ever.
NAD really became known as an innovative brand that came up with some incredible ideas and concepts that were not just features that were a bell or a whistle, they were features that actually made the music sound better. One of the things they did in the 80s was they did a study exactly what were the average power levels required to reproduce music and what were the peak levels required. And they found the most dynamic music they could find, the 1812 Overture by Tchaikovsky with a cannon shooting at the end. And these were the LPs that had the most dynamic swing on them, from the most quiet to the most loud. And they realized that the traditional amplifiers of the day didn't have enough dynamic power to reproduce those musical peaks.
And so what you need is dynamic headroom. And that is exactly what the power envelope circuitry would do. It would give you dynamic headroom and bags of it too. What Eric did with the 2200 was allow the amplifier to run on two sort of power levels. The normal steady state sort of power, which was the 2x100 watts. But if the music demanded, it could switch up to this higher power supply where it would pump out prodigious amounts of power, like 400, 500 watts. So it would actually play much, much louder and behave like an amplifier that would be like 3-4 times the power. And even today you can find YouTube films where people tested 2200, a vintage product, and they tested 20 years after date, and they drive it dynamically into 2 ohms, and it will put out as a monoblock close to 2000 watts. I mean, it's outrageous. And again, such a real-world approach.
Power envelope was a very interesting technology, but it did have a couple of limitations to it. One of them was the switch over from the low voltage, high current supply to the high voltage supply to the peaks, which is the characteristic of power envelope. And there was a glitch where it switched in, and that really drove Eric a little bit crazy, I think. He said, you know, that we've got to find a way to eliminate that. And he came up with a very interesting, typically Eric kind of a concept. He said, well, let's do it the other way around. Let's run the power supply full unless the amplifier sees a really low impedance, in which case we'll actually readjust the power supply parameter dynamically, and that became power drive, which meant high dynamic power, low impedance drive.
When you tell the NAD story and you tell the Lenbrook story, from 1978, you see 3 or 4 times through those stories where the companies really come together. They were using a contract manufacturer in Taiwan, and that manufacturer kind of overnight gave NAD an ultimatum.
We at Foolette have decided that we are the important element in this success of NAD. We are going to acquire NAD. We're going to buy you. They were producing 80% of all the products that we sold. So I called a hasty board of directors meeting and very reluctantly presented the plan. Our Canadian distributor, a certain David Simmons, said, "No way, we're going to fight this. We have to find another factory." A. Lin, who had been the plant manager at Foolette for many years, had left and started his own trading company. And he knew all the factories in Taiwan, and he knew other factories. And he assured me, "I know another factory that's at least as good as Foolette, but it's going to take them 8 months to a year to tool up and be ready to produce." There was going to be a gap of between 8 months and a year in which there would be no product shipped. So we knew that we had to stay alive for a year.
Distributors had to order for the next full year, pay for the next full year. It was unbelievable, actually. I can remember, my dad with files on the dining room table, this country, that country, everybody's orders, are they paid?
And I had a year's worth of inventory paid for in advance, which meant that we could stay alive for 1 year because of the total support of our sales network.
NAD became much more than just a tiny company in terms of how many products it would actually sell, and also the width and the scope of the products.
We have been running it on the basis of the fact that the so-called parent company was being supported by a very small percentage override on the cost of the product. We effectively were not designed to make any money. The idea was that the distributors would make all the profit.
It became difficult in terms of maintaining product quality and consistency. And this is where once what was an advantage, being small, agile, flexible, became almost like a little bit of an Achilles heel, because we couldn't do the sort of thoroughness that our products required.
It was a recession, and we were short of cash. So we asked some of our distributors if they would be willing to step in.
NAD owned its own US distribution company. We were actually looking to become a North American company. So we acquired the US sales subsidiary in 1991. In 1992, NAD was sold as a company to the Danish distributor, the Scandinavian distributor, a company called Audio Nord. They took over the NAD brand. We were the North American distributor. They owned the NAD brand.
The company survived, and the company made good progress during that time. There was this feeling that this is a company worth saving.
Marty really realized that you need to let Eric do what he's good at, and that is developing products that he really believes in. This is the 118, and this is pretty much the brainchild of Björn Eric Edwardson. Pretty early on, he realized the power of DSP, digital signal processing. This is the world's first stereo DSP preamplifier. Remember, we're talking about 1995 here, so it's pretty early days for this type of technology.
In DSP, you can change all characteristics of sound without any of the bad side effects. In the analog world, every time you add a feature, you actually take away some of the sound quality.
The knowledge of DSP and programming, NAD was way, way ahead of anybody.
It was, I would say, at that point, 10 years ahead of its time in what the consumer would have understood and known.
For quite a few people, this was a little bit too abstract, if you like, and perhaps offering solutions for a problem that they didn't really have.
We as engineers understood fully and said, wow, we want this, we can do all these things magically inside. The DSP allows us to do all that, which you can only dream of in the analog domain. But that message was probably lost, I would say.
And the other thing, to be quite frank, is that it's a really plain Jane looking unit.
I guess being engineers, we kind of looked on the inside, and the industrial design on the outside didn't reflect what was on the inside.
Its cosmetics really didn't exude, hey, this is something special here.
AudioNord soon realized that for real success, a brand like NAD really needed to be driven from the North American market. The North America was the market that was driving things like audio video receivers, digital amplification. It was really driving the next generation of hi-fi and AV products. That brought Lenbrook, our company, together with NAD in another new way, which was AudioNord asked us, would you guys be willing to acquire the brand and drive the brand?
And so I got on a plane and arrived in good old Canada. Came in and said, look, we know what you're here for, and you don't stand the chance. We've got enough things on our plate. The last thing in the world we want to do is acquire NAD. It's not going to happen. It's just a wasted trip on your part. I said, well, okay, but I'm here. It's good to be here. Why don't we just have a chat? 20 minutes later, they bought the company. That's all it took for them to decide, yeah, you're right. We're going to buy it. And they did.
In the mid to end 90s, it was really like we were running after ourselves in order to make good what went wrong before. Luckily, Lenbrook stepped in and took over from Hi-Fi Kluben, or AudioNord at the time, and was able to put in the resources that were needed to make sure that we were back on track.
It was very important for NAD's future to create sellable, unique AVRs that have NAD attributes.
I think there is a misguided belief that for AV, you could get away with perhaps less quality. You know what? An explosion or a gunshot is just that, an explosion or a gunshot. Lots of noise. We think that is a wrong approach to it. Perhaps you want to be able to play really high quality music in surround sound. So the approach to the quality of the amplifiers really shouldn't be that much different as you would have to normal stereo products.
Part of the challenge was, how do we take the qualities that made us famous in stereo and translate them into this new audio video world?
And like we've done with our stereo amplifiers as well, NAD has always been noted that its power specifications, or all of its specifications, are really what it will do at minimum. And reviewers again and again confirmed, well, actually, it will put out more power than it specifies. Its distortion is actually lower than NAD specifications, which is really contrary to what was happening in the industry. All of these AV receivers out there had claimed in their brochure prodigious amounts of power, when in actual fact, they weren't that beefy at all. But we did make a point of making sure people would understand how we arrived at our figures and how the others would arrive at their figures. That is comparing apples with rotten pears.
And so we came up with a way of expressing that we called full disclosure power, which in essence was sort of saying, well, the other guys are all cheating. We're going to tell you the whole truth here. And that kind of authenticity is something that is part of the NAD brand.
NAD's spec sheet speaks to the reality. You can measure that, you can see that. And it's a rarity in the consumer business, and serves as a gateway into understanding other real concepts.
with so many connections and so many amplifiers and early days of video processing, every 8 to 12 months, they were leapfrogging the technologies.
For us to redevelop a whole new AV receiver every year was not practical for a company of our size.
And it's almost perverse that people are almost forced to buy every once or every 2 years a new AVR because there's a new standard.
Buying something to throw away was not part of the NAD ethos. So we made those components on plug-in modules so that the hardware could actually be upgraded. We didn't have to redesign the whole thing and come up with a new model and new safety regulations and all the rest. We could just upgrade the unit. So you could replace just the module and make that receiver work with your new TV set, with the new surround formats, the new software that was coming out.
These are the things that change. And that is exactly what MDC allows us to do. Extend the life of our platform and continuously expand it.
And we fulfilled our promise by making the upgrades available and making them at an affordable price.
We were at the end of the road for Class AB. And at the same time, Eric in particular had already been investigating what was happening on the Class D front. This is at an age that anything that reeked of Class D was vilified as almost evil. Eric persevered and knew that there was something in this technology.
If you look inside the brain of a Class D amplifier, there's a lot of high rate changes of energy changing in those transistors. And they burst and change at the rate at which the music is being delivered. Why do this? It's simply more efficient. It's how fancy electric drive systems work, even electrical motors and things that are mechanical.
Class D amplifiers didn't have an effective way of compensating in real time for what was going on inside the amplifier. No one had figured out how to do that yet. Z-Tex had a concept for that.
If you want to make a decent amplifier, you have to use feedback. It's only how you apply feedback. The technology, direct digital, where Z-Tech did a lot of the development, but under our guidance in order to make this a really competitive sort of amplifier technology.
Anything that was in the transistor that wasn't perfect, you could perfect it using the real-time feedback loop.
And that worked really well. And it made that the amplifier had very low distortion figures, very stable into low frequencies, could drive any loudspeaker.
This eventually led to the M2 amplifier, which was a groundbreaking product for us and for the industry. Made a statement that digital amplification had arrived.
If you read the reviews of the time, those magazines that tested it and also that measured it said, well, this is the future.
Eric Edvardson was really proud of this. He was very involved in the development. He saw the future as being digital. This was a product that we put a marker in the sand saying, we will not come out with a digital amplifier until we can make a digital amplifier that exceeds the capability of analog amplifiers.
People that listened to this amplifier would find that it was far more revealing, far more detailed than anything else out there.
To do Class D really well was a bit more expensive actually than doing Class AB. We needed to find solutions that could be scaled, so we came up with hybrid digital that used a slightly different type of amplifier topology, switching amplifiers that work with an analog signal and do a very precise job of amplifying it.
And again, it's through the relationships that we have directly with these companies that NAD was the first company to release an amplifier with Eigentech technology from a company Purify, the NAD M33. That amplifier is so good that it's at the limits of what the very best measuring equipment can even measure. So sometimes you don't know whether you're measuring your own equipment, your measuring gear, or whether you're measuring the amplifier, because it's at that incredibly low level. This uses also feedback, but it uses feedback after the output filter. the amplifier is completely impervious to whatever loudspeaker you connect to it. Low impedance, high impedance, it only does amplification at the exact same level. It doesn't change in any way its own sound character. Distortion level is really low at very low volume levels. When there is silence, there is silence. You get that eerie black in the background. And you know what? That is actually where most of your listening happens. In that first watt is where you hear all the tiny little details that really gives you that insight into what you're listening to. And hooked to really good loudspeakers gives you a performance that is literally unheard of until Eigentakt came along.
I love when people describe NAD as being pragmatic. It's a great word. That is what NAD is, and that led to great innovation.
I mean, I really see a brand as a promise to a consumer. So if a consumer buys an NAD, our promise to them is that it's going to have exceptional audio performance and great reliability and a sensible feature set that doesn't go over the top with bells and whistles, but has everything you need to get the job done.
It's about narrowing things down to an essence of relevance to a particular set of customers who appreciate substance over delivered features. NAD's customers historically, and it continues today, appreciate a solid design ethic and delivering natural sound quality in a world that's getting more and more filled with distractions and the possibilities to do so. It's a question of what's relevant.
The 50 years have been really exciting for a whole multitude of reasons, but looking ahead, I think the next 50 years are going to be exciting for a whole different reason. So I think NAD's best days are ahead.
I think NAD's values, which are really performance, simplicity, value, innovation, these are things that are authentic values. They translate directly into products you can see and hear and touch. And I think that authenticity, that long 50-year history of a consistent story. We've always told the same story. We've always even had the same visual look to the products. As we've moved into the 21st century, we've expanded in areas, and also I would say in visual design, we've made improvements there as well. But the core values of NAD are exactly the same as applied to modern technology, modern sources. And we find that the new generation of music lovers coming up, I think there's a real renaissance of music listening that's occurring. We think that the future will see a change in the way people consume music. Certainly, we're in the streaming age right now. Through the Blue OS system, we actually, in a sense, a direct connection into the customer's listening room.
Ease of getting to your music, and the more accessible it is, and the easier to get to it, and the more accurate it sounds, and the better it sounds, all of those things will constantly be playing into it.
They can see and they can feel and they can hear the care that goes into developing these products and the honest way that we reproduce the music without adding gimmicks.
I think that both Marty and Eric would be proud of where we are now. By looking forward into new technologies, but not forgetting where we came from. The core values will remain as is, and that we're getting into really exciting technologies, which Eric perhaps may have foreseen and Marty may have foreseen as well, but that it has progressed, because it's a relatively short time since Marty passed away and Eric passed away. But the big strides that we have taken in the meantime, I don't think any of us could have predicted that.
Eric was very generous. He had a lot of proteges that had his same value for really a kind of perfection in sound reproduction, a very straightforward, down-to-earth way of getting there.
Anything overcomplicated, he would just scratch on and say, start over again. That just doesn't work. Creative solutions, make it super simple. That's, again, stuck in my mind because that's always the word he would always use in the lab. You know, Susie, super simple.
I would say that Marty and Lenbrook had a perfect alignment. They had the same values in terms of we're selling on relationship.
We often sit and just say, if only Marty could be alive to see what NAD's become today. You know, both Eric and Marty worked on NAD right to their last day, right to their last breath. It's actually really remarkable. So we had the chance for them to start to see some of these signs of real success as NAD's matured and taken the lead in its space, in its market.
I think they'd be proud of us, and their legacy is safe.
The fact is that our lives are meaningless without music. These are companies that know that, understand that, and will be there to provide whatever the method is, they will be providing it. And 40 years from now, they're still going to be around because they haven't lost sight of what counts.